Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I know our very large audience is coming from across the world. I'm Ali Bedad, the director of the Center for Near Eastern Studies. And on behalf of my colleagues at the center, I would like to welcome you to today's event to celebrate the publication of our colleague Domenico Ingenito's Beholding Beauty, Saʿdi of Shiraz, and the Aesthetics of Desire in Medieval Persian Poetry. I would like to take this opportunity to thank our co-sponsors, the Program on Central Asia, Department of Comparative Literature, Department of Near Eastern Languages and Cultures, the Center for Medieval and Renaissance Studies, the Program in Iranian Studies, and the Pur Dawood Center for the Study of the Iranian World. As some of you know, CNES was founded in 1957 and is a research hub where over 100 faculty from humanities, social sciences, arts, and the law school collaborate in a variety of research and pedagogical projects. What makes a center such as the CNES successful, an important venue for the exchange of ideas and the dissemination of knowledge about the MENA region within and beyond the campus, is the quality of its affiliated faculty whose cutting-edge scholarship and teaching bring fresh perspective on the challenges and cultural richness of the region. So it gives me special pleasure today to host today's event to celebrate the recent publication of our colleague Domenico's wonderful new book, Beholding Beauty. Domenico represents the ideal model of an academic, for he's not only a first-rate scholar, but also a great teacher and a dedicated citizen of his department, the Program in Iranian Studies, and the CNES. And we are indeed very fortunate to have him as a colleague at UCLA. Domenico, who received his PhD in Persian language and literature from Università di Napoli L'Orientale, Italy in 2012, is an associate professor in the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Cultures. His stellar scholarship addresses a wide range of topics from pre-modern Persian poetry to anthropology of ritual and symbolic representation, and from topics in comparative literature to material culture and Iranian cinema. He's the recipient of several awards and honors, including a Rotary Club Prize for the Best MA Thesis in Comparative Literature and an Erasmus Scholarship. We're very fortunate to have two great scholars to discuss Domenico's book, and I would like to introduce them very briefly and welcome them now. Our first panelist is Professor Paul Lozenski, who is a professor of comparative literature and Central Eurasian Studies, as well as the director of Persian language program at the Indiana University. His scholarship focuses on translation, translation history, and theory. He's the author of Welcoming Firani, Imitation and Poetic Individuality in the Safavid, Mughal, Ghazal, in which he offers an illuminating discussion of the development of Indian style during Safavid and Mughal era. His translation work include Farid al-Din Attar's Memorial of God's Friends, as well as Amir Khosrow's poetry in the Bazaar of Love. More recently, he has been working on the intersection of architecture and literature, exploring the ways in which Persian poetry depicts both real and imaginary buildings, as well as the use of architectural metaphors in Persian poetry. Our second speaker is Jane Mickelson, who's a postdoctoral fellow and lecturer at the University of Virginia. Dr. Mickelson received her PhD in 2019 from the University of Chicago, where she wrote a wonderful dissertation entitled Worlds of the Imagination, Bedell of Delhi and Early Modern Persian Lyric Style. Her articles on Bedell's figuration of the lyric self and other topics have appeared in the Journal of South Asian Intellectual History and Comparative Studies of South Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, among other venues. Like our first panelist, she is also a translator and has translated some of Bedell's lyric poems on meditation. Now, I would like to invite Domenico to make a brief presentation of his new book. Afterward, our speakers will present their responses to the book, and then Domenico will briefly respond to their comment. So please join me in welcoming Domenico and our speakers, Professor Lozenski and Dr. Mickelson.
Thank you so much. Thank you for such a generous presentation, Professor Behdad, for hosting this event. I'm truly moved by not only by the generosity of all the programs and the centers that are involved in this book launch, but also by the intellectual friendship that Paul Lozenski and Jane Mickelson also are offering us today with their time and patience. I'm also very moved by the number of colleagues and friends all around the world who are joining us. I see that the number of attendees is now around over 200 people, and I recognize many familiar names. I cannot see your faces. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here, and all the new friends that are joining us today. I received my copies of the book yesterday. I'm showing it briefly. It's here. And I prepared a PowerPoint just to go through in a very informal way, and I apologize for the informal register of this presentation. It would be just a general overview of what the book is about, and then I will let Jane and Paul elaborate on specific aspects of this work. You know, the work is about Saʿdi of Shiraz, who is probably one of the most important poets of the Persian classical canon. He flourished during the 13th century. Saadi has been studied for several decades, for several centuries in the West. Few monographs have been dedicated to his lyric poetry, to his ghazals. There were excellent books that have been published recently in English on the overall overarching aspects of Saadi's literary output. I see also Professor Kishavarz is with us today. She also published a wonderful book about Saadi, but I decided to bridge this gap and write about his lyric poetry. Overall, you will see some images from manuscripts for this research. I've been working on about 28 manuscripts, some of which have never been studied. Others have been used for partial critical editions. So I've tried also to re-engage the original documents in ways that somehow can fix some of the issues that are found also in the critical editions of some of Saadi's works. We know very little about Saadi's life. He died in 1292, maybe 1291. Some manuscripts helped me also establish the precise date of his death. That was a contentious problem for several years in the field. He studied the Nizamiya school, allegedly, in Baghdad in the 1230s, and was loosely attached to the Suravardiya Sufi order. We can talk about this later. And what is interesting is that he sought political and literary patronage throughout his life. The major works by Saadi that are usually scholars focus on, and readers also cherish the most, are the Saadi Nameh, or the Bustan, and the Gulistan. Usually the dates that appear in most publications are the final composition dates of these books, which are 1257 for the Bustan and 1258 for the Gulistan. I've tried to reframe the problem of the composition. The manuscripts show that there are several stages of composition for this. There are different recensions, and both books Saadi started writing both books in the 50s. There is the whole problem of the alleged return of Saadi to Shiraz in the late 50s and so on. We can talk about this. I tried to reassess completely the entire biography of this poet. As I said, the focus of my book are the ghazals, the lyric poems. There are about 700 in different collections, composed and put together in different stages of Saadi's life. So we have the delights of Tayyibat in the 50s, the marvels most likely composed in the 1260s, and the final seals of Khawatim from the 1270s and on. There is a very interesting section of Saadi's work, the obscene works, probably composed in the early 1260s. We'll talk about this as well, and the praise poems. Saadi was very active with the political circles of his time, Salguri dynasty, the Atabegs of Fars, Jubani family later on. the Mongol notables and Shirazi religious scholars. And also intellectual literary circles are extremely important to understand Saadi's intellectual framework. When working on Saadi's poetry, one of the most baffling characteristics of his verses is that they are extremely simple. They read as an extremely simple and smooth, yet inimitable, yet inaccessible kind of beauty. And it's interesting how the work of translating Saadi's poetry is one of the most challenging, frustrating experiences that a scholar in Persian literary study can ever face, because translations simply never get to the point of that balanced softness and smoothness that one finds in those lines. That's why I was comparing Saadi's poetry with Rothko, and the experience of admiring a beautiful image without really recognizing anything, without even knowing what to say about an image apart from describing its sort of main components. I would like to think about Saadi's poetry as an experience that is more about contemplation initially. And this very contemplative modality that Saadi urges us to follow, that has prevented for many decades scholars from cracking the secret of the intellectual components of his poetry. There is an example of one of the most beautiful openings of his ghazals, which expresses this inimitable smoothness. I read it first in Persian. Man chera del be to dadam ke delam mishkani, ya che kardam ke negah baz be man mi nakoni. دل و جانم به تو مشغول، دل و جانم به تو مشغول و نظر در چپ و راست، تا ندانند حریفان که تو منظور منی. دیگران چون بروند از نظر، دیگران چون بروند از نظر، از دل بروند. تو چنان در دل من رفته که جان در بدنی. Why did I give you my heart? You will break it, I know. What did I do? Why don't you look at me anymore? My heart and soul focus on you, but my gaze roams away. My rivals should not understand that you are the object of my glances. I look at other beauties. They leave my heart as soon as they leave my sight. But you firmly penetrate my heart like the soul inhabits the body. There are several prejudices and biases surrounding the modern reception of Saadi's poetry. And in my book, I try to address these issues. And so I'm showing you this highlighted in red, this main biases and how I try to cope with this and rediscuss this problem. So there is this idea of the predominance of ethical and didactic dimensions in Saadi's poetry. Saadi is usually perceived as a boring, ethical, moralistic kind of author that has nothing to do with the complexities that will be explored together. It is true, the ethical discourse is only one among many other dimensions that characterize Saadi's work. The primary function of this ethical discourse is to guide ideal rulers, ideal readers, rulers and common folks alike, toward the quest for a golden mean and a nuanced balance between mundanity and spirituality. Another prejudice relates to the distance from political power, politics, and courtly affairs. Saadi's attachment to power is always problematic. We can discuss this. It is a cultural problem. It is a contemporary cultural problem that prevents us and prevents most readers from understanding the value of Saadi's attachment to political power. Saadi, in fact, sought the favor of rulers and patrons throughout his entire life, often striving to access the entourage of younger princes, regardless of their dynastic affiliations. We will see why this is important. There is an heteronormative bias. It is true that in Persian, the grammatical gender of the beloved is not expressed, but we have to understand from the historical overarching structure of the kind of desire that is expressed in this kind of poetry. The aesthetics of desire that Saadi portrays in his works are predominantly homoerotic. It is disarming, though, when we read entries, for instance, in the Encyclopedia Iranica about homosexuality in Persian literature, because there's nothing to do with the modern Western concept of homosexuality. I do not want to sound like Ahmadinejad, who says that there is no homosexuality in Iran, but the point is that anthropologically speaking, there is a completely different set of norms and values and aesthetics that are in place when we talk about homoeroticism, specifically in the poetry, in Saadi's poetry. It is a kind of functional homoeroticism that relates to ritualized ideals of kingship and sacred forms of eroticism. There are also many biographistic assumptions. Saadi talks a lot about himself, and many scholars for many decades have been taking at face value whatever Saadi says about himself. I've tried to reassess the validity of these assumptions. Very little historical accurate information can be gathered from Saadi's autobiographical claims. The most important details, though, can be gleaned through the analysis of less studied texts and the ideals of authorship that the poet developed around his literary renown, mainly for political purposes. Saadi is often seen as a primarily mystical poet. There is one book about Saadi's ghazals. There's only one major publication in Persian about Saadi's ghazals, and it's a book by Said Hamidian, Saadi Dar Ghazal. And the main focus of the book is that there is this idea of mysticism that pervades the entire Saadi's poetry, in complete dismissal of the erotic aspects of his ghazals. While the spiritual dimension of Saadi's poetry cannot be denied, his representations of love enact the human appreciation of physical beauty through the role of the external senses and the imaginative faculties of the individual. It is also true that some scholars, on the other hand, read Saadi as a purely erotic poet. So we have this constant querelle, right, between those who defend Saadi's mysticism and those who are suggesting that there is an exclusively erotic aspect. Saadi's expression of love and desire cannot be understood without taking into account the sacred eroticism that exudes from his poems. In his ghazal, Saadi conceives of the visible world as an arena in which the divine splendor can be understood through the contemplation on mundane beauty. And the final problem, there is Saadi's dismissal of philosophy. And in general, there is still a lot of work to do in the field to understand what the role of philosophy has been in the shaping of thought expressed by these poets in their verses. The peculiar combination of pragmatic rationalism, mundane commitments, and spiritual aesthetics that characterize Saadi's work reveals that the poet was deeply influenced by a complex network of correspondences between moderate strands of Sufi thought and Islamic philosophy. The manuscripts are extremely useful when we tackle this kind of problems. For instance, the controversy on the mystical mundane nature of Saadi's lyric poems. Is the beloved a reflection of God? Is the beloved just a human person? Was Saadi a mystic? Was he a Sufi? Did he have one of these manuscripts? This manuscript, for instance, kept in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France in Paris, has been studied by other scholars, but this specific folio has never been really looked at, and it declares very clearly when and where and how and by whom Saadi's Sufi lodge, Saadi's monastery, we could say also, was established, how much was spent, and when and by whom it was restored in the outskirts of Shiraz, a few decades after the death of the author. So this is why I've tried to go back to these original documents in order to reassess this kind of problems. I will briefly now sketch the main topics of the book by showing that the book is divided into 3 different parts, and they're interconnected, of course, but they can also be read as separate monographs. And I try to account for the complexity of Saadi's thought and the connection between mundanity and spirituality by dedicating the first part to the material aspect, to the physical aspect of the contemplation of beauty and the politics of contemplating beauty that exudes from his poems. Whereas the second part focuses on the spirit, it focuses on thought, on the philosophy behind it, it focuses on the Sufi influence on Saadi's poetry. And then the third part is the enactment, is the enactment of these physical and metaphysical ideals and practices through recitation and the circulation of his poetry, and we'll be talking about that as well later. So the first part, which I titled Uncovering the Skin of the Ghazal, opens with a chapter that discusses the homoerotics of political power and the emergence of gender desires. Right? So the question is, what is the relationship between ritualized homoeroticism and political power in the context of Saadi's literary activity in the Salghurid and Ilkhani courts? So it's an attempt to redefine the prejudice that would completely dismiss not only the gender of the beloved in Saadi's poetry, but also the historical function of this. There is a reason why, and there was an effect that was primarily political and aesthetic and philosophical. There are some lines that I'm showing, for instance, how these two elements are intertwined. We don't really have much time, so I will skip the lines for now. The second chapter is about the nature of lyric poetry in the context of autobiographism. How truthful is lyric poetry as a fictional discourse, and how does it connect with the relationship between history, biography, and courtly ideas of power and factual eroticism? What happens in a lyric poem? What kind of truth emerges from a lyric poem? And how did Saadi frame this problem within the context of his major works in prose, like the Golestan or Rose Garden, which is presents a mix of prose and verse? How does a pseudo-autobiographical text enact lyric poetry by mimicking an ideal representation of the external world? And I think that Professor Lozenski will be talking about this aspect later. And then I refrained from sharing obscene texts because I do think that they require context. And I'm sorry, Paul, I know that that's your favorite chapter. I try to look at the obscene text as counter texts for Saadi's lyric voice and a reflection of Saadi's mystical afflatus. So I try to look at both aspects of his poetry to see how there is a reification, sexual reification, and a spiritual fetishization taking place in his poetry. The second part is the most probably important section of the entire book. Through the mirror of your glances, the sacred aesthetics of Saadi's lyric subject, the body as a divine sign, what are the hermeneutics of spiritual desire, how does the human beloved reflect divine beauty, is the beloved an incarnation of God, does he iconically signal his ineffable presence, how to reassess the problem of the vision of God in the context of Saadi's poetry. We have this line, مردم از ترس خدا سجده رویت نکنند بامدادت که ببینند و من از حیرانی. You appear in the morning and no one bows down to worship your face. Why? People fear God, whereas I am too bewildered to prostrate. The lines, it looks very smooth, but there is. I wrote a whole chapter to discuss what's happening in these shifts that you can see between these two mystics. The RF as a beholder, the divine pen depicting the khat of the beloved. So here I try to also to make sense of the erotic component in conversation with the hermeneutics of trying to visualize God. There's this beautiful line in which Saadi says, on the page-like cheek of the beautiful ones, they see the downy beard, khat, which means both downy beard and writing of scripture. Short is their sight, but the beholder, the RF, contemplates the pen of God's creation. The chapter 6, I'm glad I see Professor Mariam Sebti today, who is one of the main experts on Avicenna and the Abyssinian tradition, especially as far as the study of the internal senses and Abyssinian psychology is concerned. And her work deeply inspired this chapter, and along with work of other scholars such as Gutas and others. I try to show how important the heritage of Islamic philosophy in combination with different trends in the field of Sufi thought for the development of the psychology of Saadi's lyric subject. So there is this whole extremely complex, extremely interesting, fascinating theory, the internal senses, that explain how we imagine things, how we produce mental images of things and how these mental images interact with external reality. And throughout Saadi's ghazals, there are many references to this tradition, which doesn't mean that Saadi was systematically transcribing science and philosophy into his poems, but it was part of, as Jane Mickelson says, an ambient availability. He was there in the circles to which he belonged, and he did reflect in his poetry, just like some of contemporary scientific paradigms can be reflected in the poetry that is produced today in the US or in Iran or in other literary traditions. So for instance, so pervasive is the depiction of the beloved in my imagination that no intelligibles, maqul, are any longer depicted in my mind. In another poem, he says, everyone's mind imagines someone's beautiful face, but the one I imagine is beyond imagination. And I think that here he's using different ways, different aspects of the imaginative faculties in this poem. And then another line is, from the aperture of my thinking, fikrat, which is a key word, my heart showed to the rational soul the signs of my desperation. I'm not elaborating on chapters 7 and 8, in which I put the theory of internal sense in conversation with Al-Ghazali, especially in one book, major book, composed in Persian, Kimya Sadat, The Alchemy of Bliss, and I try to show how there is a practice of contemplating beauty for spiritual ends that exists throughout the entirety of Saadi's poetry. And I think that Jane would be elaborating on aspects of this problem. The third part, the lyrical ritual, Sama, as the performative space of sacred eroticism, in which I try to make sense of the circulation of Saadi's poetry and how performance and performativity interplay in the composition and circulation of Saadi's ghazals. And I'm done, I think, for today. I will just present very briefly 4 or 5 points. I refer to these as paradigm shifts through the historicization of Saadi's life and works. And the book aims to offer several paradigm shifts in the study of Saadi's poetry, which I'm analyzing here. I try to shift and focus on Saadi's ethics to Saadi's aesthetics. So from the emphasis on prescriptive moral norms to the study of the centrality of the realm of vision and the role of the body for the exploration of the visible and the invisible. From the mundane versus spiritual dichotomy, I don't really care anymore about this controversy, to an integrated study of the relationship between the physical and metaphysical dimensions of the act of contemplating beauty in its material and imaginal manifestations. From the dismissal of Saadi's intellectual endeavors to the retrieval of the complex of ideals, discourses, and practices that characterize Saadi's cultural upbringing between Shiraz, Baghdad, and Tabriz, both synchronically and diachronically. And then I attempted a reassessment of Saadi's non-scholastic Sufi tendencies through the lens of the historical relationship between philosophy and Sufi thought and its ambient availability, as Jane says, in 13th century Shiraz. And finally, a shift from hermeneutical approaches to Sufi poetry to the recognition of specific models of intellection, sensory perception, and imagination that inform the historical construction of the lyric subject. And this is the last one, I promise. I cannot see this correctly here. Reconceptualization of lyric poetry as a discourse that is both conventional and confessional in its forms and effects. Performance and performativity are the main axes that allow the circulation of this poetry for courtly, aesthetic, and spiritual ends. And I'm good for now, and I think that thank you for your attention. I believe that Paul comes next.
It's a real honor for me to be asked to participate in this. I have been involved in the gestation, we might call it, of this book for several years now. I've read numerous drafts, and Domenico and I have had numerous conversations about the book. So it's nice to be here as a midwife, bringing this long gestating book into the public eye. I have yet to receive my copy, but I was very happy to get the page proofs. of the final version of the book from Brill, and it was nice to see that all of the baby's limbs are in their proper place, and he seems to be responding to visual stimuli. In any case, I'm going to really sort of focus on the theoretical groundings as I see them of Domenico's project. Jane and I have kind of agreed that we're going to point to particular passages. So I guess if you're making a list while you're waiting for your copy of the book to arrive, you should write down part 1, chapter 2, part 2, the introduction, and chapter 6, and the introduction to part 3. This is where Domenico, often very unobtrusively, introduces quite a insightful theoretical framework for what he engages in. And he begins this project really in chapter 2 of part 1, where he where he goes back to the generative semiotics of Gremus to lay out kind of a model that bridges the gap between the ghazal as sort of pure convention, nightingales, roses, gardens, inaccessible beloveds, blah, 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 ad infinitum. And the other, the opposing tendency, which is to read this poetry as though strictly for the content, as though this content was being presented to us without this whole kind of conventional material. Without going into the details of Gremus's 4-part schema, which is a schema, we kind of go from basically linguistics to what I would call conventions, to maybe the individual treatment of conventions, to then historical referentiality. And what I like about this model is that it allows us to move kind of systematic, I don't want to say systematically, but to move with a kind of logical trajectories between the conventional elements of the ghazal genre and its historical situatedness. And so this is, like I say, this is a model that I think sets up the historicist project, which lies in the center of this book. Reading Saʿdi as an author writing in a particular place, in a particular time, with a particular education, and filling in that rich historical background that informs his poetry throughout, even when the references are not explicit, even when it is sort of this ambient availability, a phrase I also like very much, and how that material then comes to shape a particular treatment of the more conventional stuff. So this is a very useful kind of historical, maybe a hermeneutic rubric, if you will, for understanding both the striving of the ghazal for eternal, for kind of an eternal validity, and its historical embeddedness. The second part of my comments, and I'm going to really try and keep on time, I might call imitation as the sincerest form of flattery. At several key moments in the book, in the passages in particular that I mentioned earlier, Domenico makes use of the response poem, putting Saadi's poetry into a network of poems that are related by rhyme and meter. And this is sometimes Saadi talking back to earlier poets. It's sometimes a later poet talking back to Saadi. Aside from the fact that this is a topic near and dear to my heart, Domenico uses it quite well as a way of demarcating what is specific to Saadi's take on mystical poetry. And he provides these exercises in comparative reading across the tradition really help him define, and I think this is one of the major accomplishments of the book, really help him define what is, if you will, characteristic of Saadi's particular, shall we call it, sober approach to Sufism. My students, and I'm sure many other readers, always think of Rumi and the ecstasy and the leaving the body. What these comparative readings do is allow Domenico to really point out a very different kind of approach to Sufi poetry. So it's always good when you take a big term like that and refine it down. And I was happy to see that the methodology of reading response poems, he made such great use of it. Like I say, the sincerest form of flattery, and I will return it by the end of my comments. The second thing that I think is another element, if you will, of Domenico's theoretical approach is his analysis of the lyric I. This is a topic that has tortured me for a couple of decades now, and I think Domenico does a wonderful job at clarifying how for lack of a better word, how an individual voice emerges from this highly convention-bound tradition. And he quite rightly points out that there is a how do we have it here? That there is this, is it confessional or conventional is one way of putting it. But perhaps more, a little more precisely is the very indeterminate relationship between the historical author and the voice of the poems that we hear, the lyric I. And again, Domenico gives us a number of ways of thinking through that problem more precisely in terms of his theoretical approach. He argues, and this is kind of paraphrasing, that what we have in the Ghazal is not so much a representation of historical experience, but a representation of the perception of historical experience. In other words, what the poems present to us is a kind of individual worldview. Not all Ghazal poets do this by any means, but the best ones do. And so that what we are given is not so much the representation of a world, but the representation of a perception of a world. And I think that's an incredibly powerful insight, and it tells us what the purpose of the Ghazal might be. I mean, he raises the very, what do words do? What does the Ghazal do socially? In Domenico's case, the answer has to do with sama, what he translates as the lyric ritual. The poem either brings us into that ritual or serves as a simulacrum of that experience. So those are what I see as some of the most important theoretical kind of groundings and insights of this work. Like I say, they're often presented very unobtrusively, but look for those introductions. You'll kind of get this, what I want. So like I said, I was going to return the favor of imitation as the sincerest form of flattery. I divide books basically into three broad categories. One of them is books I choose not to finish. The other one is books that teach me something. And the third one, and this is the category that I think I prize the most, books that make me think. Books that make me reconsider problems that I've been thinking about for a long time. Domenico's book is great because it's both 2 and 3. It both taught me a lot of things I didn't know before about 13th century intellectual life, but it also made me think. And I'll just say a couple of things about how I think it's going to affect my work on my big project, which is a book on Saʿdi. One of them is, again, it helps me define what the relations. Saʿdi frequently introduces autobiographical reflections into the final line of his ghazals, the signature verses. And it helps me, again, kind of think about how do we handle those autobiographical statements within his larger aesthetic project. A second way that I kind of am thinking about this is, what do the poems from my period do? Sama is not the central cultural institution in the 17th century that it was in the 13th century. But nevertheless, these poems are doing something, and they better be doing something because they exist by the thousands. And so trying to think through what happens when we move from a primarily oral performative context to a context in which writing and what we might call private appreciation play a lot more dominant role. The question of the social function, or the, if you will, the pragmatic function of poetry doesn't go away, but what kinds of new forms does it take? Finally, the question of the philosophical environment that surrounded Saʿd. Now, Saʿd was a much less learned man, and at least in terms of the intellectual sciences, than Saʿdi was, but nevertheless, he's being affected by a number of things. One of the things, and this is a transition into what Jane has to say, one of the concepts that I found most interesting is the concept of ibrat and ta'bir. Ibrat is, to put it crudely, the drawing of conclusions from sensory perception, the drawing of, if you will, lessons or general rules from sensory perception. In Saadi's case, the object of sensory perception is pretty much the beloved in all of his physical glory. And I'm beginning to think that one of the things that most distinguishes Saʿd has very similar emphasis on ibrat, what we can learn from the world. But what Saəd's contribution, I'm beginning to think, is that instead of just looking at the beloved, instead of looking primarily at the beloved, Saʿd really opens up this process to his broader urban environment, and brings in all kinds of aspects of whether they're material culture, kind of childhood games, all sorts of things that hadn't really found a home in the Ghazal before, begin to find a home, and they find a home in precisely this sort of way. The poem as an act of interpretation and an act of drawing lessons from the environment. And Saʿd also draws on an Avicennian concept, which is phase, kind of belongs to a cosmological rather than psychological realm. But again, these are sort of the kinds of things that Dominic's book has made me think. So I thank him for that, and for the friendship over the last several years. And again, congratulations on your brand new baby. And I will pass the baton to Jane.
Yeah, just to echo Paul, I mean, I too have just been so inspired by Domenico's scholarship and conversations over the years, and it's just a real immense honor and absolute genuine pleasure to be here today to celebrate this incredible book in public with all of you. So to reframe a figure as central to the classical canon as Saadi is to Persian literature is, for many reasons, a very bold endeavor. And what's so astonishing about beholding beauty is that Domenico reframes Saadi for us in so many different ways. So in my remarks here, I'd like to focus on two broad reappraisals of Saadi that Domenico's book gives us. So first, I'll talk about a little bit about the long-awaited full picture of Saadi's body of works that emerges from the chapters in part one, based on Domenico's philologically meticulous consideration of his entire literary output, including the obscene poems, long banished to the wings and neglected by scholars until now. And the second reframing involves attending to the wide ecosystem of philosophical thought available in the 13th century Islamic world, within which Saadi's ideas take shape. So both of these broad interventions allow us to explore in wholly new ways what Domenico so beautifully calls, quote, the open landscape of Saadi's balanced contemplation of the beauty of the world, end quote. So in part one, which I love the title of part one, Uncovering the Skin of the Ghazal, explores several intertwined questions. What do we mean by a specific lyric style? How do we identify it? Who speaks for it? What are its units and measures? Saadi has long been associated since pre-modern times with a style called sahle mumtane, what Domenico translates as inimitable smoothness, characterized by a kind of minimalism that, in Domenico's lovely description, quote, requires the dedication of attentive prospect prospectors who set their eyes on a stream and discern gold from the reflections in the water. So it's clear that love is really the central focus of the hundreds of lyric poems that Saʿdi composed. But he does not himself supply us with precise definitions of love, lust, passion. And while Saʿdi does not explicitly theorize the erotic or explain how it functions in his poems, this absence of silver platter delivered authorial intentions, as Domenico argues, need not prevent us from rigorously investigating what these concepts mean for Saʿdi and how they function. Instead of settling for easy, stable definitions, Domenico insists that we need to embrace the ambivalences and multiple possibilities in Saadi's works, quote, as if we were to navigate through a cluster of islands without the aid of maps, an experience of the literary territory that is rhizomatic rather than cartographical, end quote. So this book really urges us to attend to many different kinds of instabilities and indeterminacies. These range from textual to conceptual, aesthetic and contextual, instead of eliding or collapsing them and really seeing where this leads us. The aim of part one is to present the full range and texture of the Saadian spiritual intellectual sensorium. And this means attending seriously also to the Khabisat, the obscene pornographic poetry largely ignored by scholarship, which is, I think, explored with really great nuance by Domenico in chapter 3. And what really comes through here is the rich porousness between modalities and genres and registers and concepts in Saadi's system. It would be philologically unsound, as Domenico shows, to dismiss or diminish the sensuality and homoeroticism that is so central to Saadi's corpus. And one of the many truly exciting contributions of this book is that it shows us how seemingly distinct, even opposed entities, like the amatory and pornographic lyric, also poetry and prose, politics and lust, spiritual devotion and carnal desire, how all of these together constitute a very flexible system of ideas that requires and thrives on ambiguity and versatility. For instance, we see how Saadi develops what Domenico calls, quote, a rhetorical and stylistic conflation of homoeroticism, lyricism, and political insight as a literary modality, end quote. When Saadi composes verses that linger on physical beauty as an embodiment of his patron's princely qualities, these poems begin to embody what Domenico calls, quote, a sexualized representation of political power, creating a synergy between the erotic and the encomiastic, end quote. And these synergies, which are explored in great historical, philological, and critical depth in the book, are not the result of Saadi's rote rearrangement of fixed concepts. On the contrary, even something as apparently concrete as desire in Saadi's hands is represented with ambivalences and plural possibilities, creating unresolved tensions rather than conveying specific intentions. So in the chapters of part one, we see, for instance, how fluid the gender of the beloved can be within the economies and entanglements of desire. We are also attuned in new ways by Domenico to the shimmering interplay between reality and fiction, convention and concrete representation. We learn that, contrary to the dictates of medieval Persian amatory lyric, where the beloved is traditionally a beautiful boy who captures the gaze of an older man, some of Saadi's poems also describe encounters with someone conspicuously not younger, someone who is in fact, quote, a strong man who has long since crossed the threshold of manhood, end quote. Unlike many typical subvarieties of pornographic poems from the period that trade primarily in the humorously bawdy or the shockingly grotesque, Saadi's obscene poems can do more than merely amuse, shock, or elicit other varieties of 13th century pearl clutching. Rather, Domenico shows us that other indeterminate intimacies are present here as well. In Saadi's poems, we can see all of these, of all things, amatory lyric shining through just below the surface. Domenico argues that obscene poems ought to be read as countertexts to the amatory lyric, showing how close intertextual ties between serious and obscene texts reveal a poetic system that spans a plurality of approaches to the depiction of desire. So what is the effect of this on readers and listeners? The more the reader is simultaneously exposed to these two seemingly very different sides of the lyric spectrum, the more the demarcation between them appears blurred. As Domenico says, quote, once we familiarize ourselves with the possibility of a pornographic representation floating under the skin of the courtly, end quote, this allows us then to reread and reappraise Saadi's ghazals through the lens of diverse semiotic possibilities. The following line from an obscene poem by Saadi in Domenico's wonderfully restrained, I think, and very chiseled translation exemplifies some of these ambiguities of desire and lust, speech and silence. How could I be fulfilled by just looking at you? Other actions I imagine, but none of them can I say to you. And there's a sudden delicacy here, right? There's the reference to acts unfolding in the imagination yet left unsaid that is really rather shocking. The very presence of something like amatory lyric decorum here in an obscene poem is really arresting. The approach laid out in the book of considering obscene and courtly amatory lyric poems as mutually dependent countertexts, as co-constituents of an interconnected textual system, allows us to see how these poems can open up to new shades of meaning, each lyric modality uncovering what is latent in the other in suggestively indeterminate plural ways. One of the most humane and important theoretical contributions of part one is the injunction to mind the gap between modern categories and assumptions about desire, lust, sexuality, and passion, and pre-modern practices, sensibilities, and varieties of human experience that are imperfectly picked out by our modern terms. As Domenico says, if we, quote, grant these texts their partial alterity with respect to us and our categories, we might discover how the concept of love and passion celebrated by Saʿdi in his poems is much more unsettling, disturbing, and confusing than we ever could have imagined, but also more alluring, modern, and cosmopolitan. I love that quote. So if part one of the book is focused on the centrality of the body and the affordances of the senses in Saadi's textualized experiences of desire, part two situates Saadi's sacred eroticism against the broader intellectual background of the medieval Persian world. Here, Saadi's focus on carnal desire is examined within the context of a wide variety of attempts to make sense of embodied human experience, which is, of course, a vastly interdisciplinary, complex project taken up in philosophy, Sufism, politics, jurisprudence, literature, and more. Saadi is extremely coy about his sources, so the burden of reconstruction falls on modern scholarly shoulders. Where should we look for specific sources and strands of influence that shape Saadi's thought world? If Domenico shows how the possibilities offered by sensuous reality are never far from the surface of even Saadi's most chaste courtly lyrics, what theories of epistemology, psychology, cosmology, what available forms of spiritual, philosophical, structured striving allow Saadi to balance carnal desire and spiritual aspirations in his inimitably smooth way? How can beholding beauty in the world be a process capable of leading the lyric subject towards communion with the divine? Many problems press themselves on scholarly attempts to answer these questions, problems faced by many of us who work on pre-modern Persian literature. How can we reconstitute a system of thought on behalf of a figure who consciously shuns scholastic systematicity? In the 5 chapters of part 2, Domenico builds a strong case for the need to move beyond deflationary scholarly tendencies that align Saadi only with one or the other Sufi order, collapse his thought to fit under the umbrella of one system, or claim to unlock all of Saadi's ideas with a single doctrinal skeleton key. Instead, Domenico sets Saadi's theory of spiritual aesthetics within a wide plurality of thought systems. These chapters chart the affinities between Saadi's thought and Al-Ghazali's aesthetics and epistemology, and also with Avicennan rationalism and psychology. These systems, in different but connected ways, acknowledge and try to make sense of the complex embodiments and aspirations that comprise human experience, caught as it is between the visible world accessed by the 5 external senses and God's invisible realm, hidden but sometimes accessible by humans through various contemplative procedures. Al-Ghazali admits that human efforts to come into contact with God can take multiple paths. There is rational contemplation, but also visionary experience or beholding. So too in Saadi, where, as Domenico puts it, quote, sensuality and the quest for God are never mutually exclusive, end quote. They really coexist, frequently in provocative, enriching tension. Like Ghazali, Saadi acknowledges and explores these multiple access points to higher truth and doesn't shy away from the tensions between these multiple paths. In one poem, Saadi writes, anyone who has human form and defeats lustful desires will acquire human nature in full. We're nothing but animals otherwise. But then in the same poem, we have this line, I shan't free myself from these ties all my life long. In spite of his cruelty, Saadi will never detach his hand from the beloved's waist. So on the one hand, we have a poet clearly obsessed with the physical world, with the beauty that's found in experience there, and who is at the same time attentively directed towards something beyond lust. So why dwell in such complex, indirect ways on these seemingly incompatible dimensions of human desire and spiritual striving? As Domenico puts it, the body of the beloved turns into a space of semiotic conflict in which multiple desires and possibilities converge, especially with respect to the fictional world of the text and its points of contact with the external reality. Precisely by dwelling on the beloved's body as a space of multiple hermeneutic possibilities, Domenico argues that Saʿdi is highlighting and also performing different aspects of the human capacity to contextualize desire in multiple ways. Avicenna's psychology posits the fact of partnership, even of the necessary cooperation between different faculties. Higher cognitive capacities depend on the gleanings of the external senses, on data from the physical world. Building on this framework, Ghazali theorizes the permissibility of listening to amatory poetry, stressing that the listener, or reader, has interpretive license, what Domenico calls an open interpretive modality, where the gaze of the beholder of beauty is constantly shuttling between courtly amatory registers of lyric desire, the carnal realities that lurk beneath, and spiritual endeavor, whose starting point is the contemplation of physical beauty in the world. Teaching readers to transmute lower desires into more rarefied meditations on the divine and to develop self-awareness about the internal processes that make this possible is an aim that Saʿdi shares with these philosophers. These thinkers admit multiple paths to contact with the divine, while also allowing for the messiness that can result from the inevitable conflations between embodiment, lust, and spiritual yearning so unforgettably documented by Saʿdi. And I think Domenico really convincingly argues that Saadi's own approach is best understood when examined within this larger ecosystem of spiritual and philosophical ideas that were widely available and circulating in his time. So to briefly conclude, both these instances of reframing the Domenico's book enacts for Saadi are, I think, examples of open thinking, a phrase recently used by Gordon Teskey, borrowing from Adorno, to characterize the flexible system of exploratory inquiry in Spencer's Fairy Queen, where thought is not static, narrow, confined, but dynamic and open-ended. In Domenico's book, Saadi emerges as a refreshingly complex figure whose works constitute a similarly open framework for experimental thinking. Domenico insists throughout the book that we must track the tensions between genres and modalities, not fixed authorial intentions, that we ought to view Saadi's corpus as moving with great nuance through flexible systems rather than meeting out predigested ideas, that his poems are not vehicles for well-defined meanings, but spaces of possibility, and that Saadi has been received as a timeless source of wisdom precisely because he makes such open thinking available. There are so many things I love about this book, and it's truly hard to limit myself to praising only a few of them here. One thing I'd like to stress is the range of truly exciting comparative possibilities that this book opens up for medieval studies. Throughout the book, Domenico points out parallels between Saadi and Dante, between the Golestan and Canterbury Tales, the Decameron, and his brilliant insights about the psychological complexity of the lyric subject, the virtuosically achieved balance between truth and fiction, the nuanced moral realism that we see in Saadi's works. All of these contributions will be of immense interest and lasting importance for medievalists and other literary scholars far and wide. Lastly, I want to mention the deep authorial warmth that pervades this book. Domenico approaches Saadi's words, biographical traces, ideas, and contexts with such great care and commitment, and there's a real ardor in these pages that kindles and spreads to the reader. One of my favorite passages in the book is where Domenico likens the variations that vibrate throughout Saadi's ghazals to Rothko's paintings. And I'm so glad, Domenico, that you shared a Rothko with us so that people can appreciate this. Domenico says, like Rothko, Saadi's poems are made of delicate simplicity, balanced contrasts of mood, and gradual variations across the spectrum of sensory experience, end quote. In addition to the many original, innovative, and lastingly important scholarly contributions of this book, Beholding Beauty makes a humane case for the value of openness to multiple possibilities, of holistic approaches, and of non-linear exploration, in Domenico's unforgettable phrase of, quote, the anthropological complexity of the human theater, end quote. The methods and sensibilities offered in this book have really never seemed more urgently needed than today. So I'm going to stop there and turn it back over to you, Domenico.
I'm moved, beyond any capability of speech by Paul's and Jane's comments. Yeah, sorry, I needed half a minute to just recompose myself. Thank you very much. Yes, that this project is an open project. It's something I never felt I had to finish the book because I had to publish it at some point. But I really think about these possibilities as not non-static. Yeah. And these conversations are extremely interesting for me, and I look forward to rediscovering unstudied aspects of Saʿdi in the future, in the near future, and also the translations. To me, I kept translating, retranslating these poems, but I'm absolutely interested in reconsidering, retranslating, reanalyzing, and the work that you, Ali, with your center, and I want to thank all the centers and all the programs that have made this possible in co-sponsoring this event. This really makes me feel part of the community. I want to thank also Professor Rahim Sharigan, the director of the program on the Pur Dawood Center. I'm very grateful for all this support that has been filtering through the years. And thank you for the questions. These questions were absolutely marvelous. Please do contact me, and I want to keep talking about these things with all of you.
Thank you, Domenico. Yes, indeed, the book is generative. And for me, I mean, as someone who always sort of privileged Hafiz over Saadi, this definitely was a sort of at least a paradigm shift for my own mind. Thank you for that very important book. I very much look forward to reading it. And I would like to encourage our audience to order the book. And I think that you will definitely enjoy it. It's clearly a paradigm shift in terms of understanding Saadi. So thank you very much. I would like to thank our wonderful audience from across the world. I would like to thank Domenico for producing this wonderful book, generative book, and of course, Professor Lozenski and Dr. Mickelson for their great presentations. Thank you all. Thank you very much.
Thank you.